Wood is one of the oldest building materials humanity has used, dating back to the very beginnings of civilization. Traces of post holes at Paleolithic sites show that even back then, wood served as a structural element in building shelters. Later, with the advent of settled life, people realized that wood was not just a construction material, but also a good insulator. It's about 3 to 4 times warmer than ceramic bricks, and the difference compared to natural stone is even greater. However, wood's biggest downside is its flammability, Class C by ASTME 84 standards. This is why major cities in medieval Rus experienced catastrophic fires at least once a century, wiping out most of the urban landscape. Stone construction, popular in some parts of Europe, wasn't a cure-all either, as floors, ceilings, furniture, and other elements were often made of wood. So, seeing a burning stone castle wasn't exactly rare. Naturally, people back then were well aware of wood's flammability and actively exploited it in warfare. Setting enemy structures on fire from a distance was an appealing idea, so it's no surprise that the earliest recipes for incendiary arrows date back to antiquity, as described by Flavius Vegetius in his military treatises. At first glance, an arrow tipped with a flaming material seems like a deadly threat to any wooden structure. I've even been asked why, during the Hussite Wars, their war wagons weren't shot up with flaming arrows and turned to ash. But here's the thing. In medieval Europe, the primary flammable substance was wood tar. It was made through a process called dry distillation. Basically, wood was heated without direct contact with fire, causing the tar to separate out. This technique dates back to the Stone Age. In fact, some researchers believe Neanderthals were already producing small amounts of tar, using eggshells as heating chambers. Later on, tar became widely used for waterproofing boats, treating ropes, and of course making torches. During the Middle Ages, countries like Sweden produced tens of thousands, and sometimes hundreds of thousands, of barrels of tar annually. It was the medieval equivalent of oil. You'd think it'd be simple: coat a piece of fabric with tar, attach it to an arrow, and voila. But experiments, such as those conducted by the Russian Geographical Society, show it's not that straightforward. Flaming arrows with tar-soaked cloth often burn out mid-flight or when they hit the target. That's why ancient recipes for incendiary arrows often included complex mixtures of sulfur, resin, and oil. For instance, an incendiary arrow found in Lincolnshire, England, had a mix of saltpeter and charcoal wrapped in a sulfur coating. These arrows had a maximum range of about 100 meters and burned for roughly 90 seconds. In his book on gunpowder, Kelly Jack notes that one of the earliest uses of gunpowder in warfare in the East was for making incendiary arrows. If you watch YouTube videos of people trying to recreate simple flaming arrows with cloth and various flammable coatings, you'll see most attempts end with the arrow extinguishing mid-flight or on impact. But delivering fire to a target is only half the battle. Setting wood on fire with an arrow is harder than people think. To demonstrate, I ran a small experiment with 3 dry pine boards. Pine wood, thanks to its natural oils, tends to ignite faster and burn better than hardwoods. One board was left untreated. The second was rubbed with natural beeswax, something I've mentioned in a previous video as a curious fireproofing method referenced in historical sources. The third was coated with sunflower oil, a supposedly traditional method I found on construction forums, though it was meant for waterproofing. I also wondered how these boards might fare against rodents. Instead of making arrows, I used a screw with a meter of cotton bandage wrapped around it to simulate an incendiary arrowhead. Before lighting it, I added 2 milliliters of gasoline with a syringe. This amount ensures the bandage absorbs the liquid without it dripping onto the wood. First up, the untreated board, which I positioned at about a 90-degree angle. Gasoline burns at around 1300 to 1400 degrees Celsius, while the ignition temperature of most types of wood is about 250 to 300 degrees. The gasoline-soaked bandage burned for about 2 minutes. At one point, I thought the board had started smoldering even if it didn't catch fire outright. After 10 minutes, I carefully removed the board and set it aside. A few minutes later, any signs of burning or smoldering were completely gone. The next test involved the board coated with beeswax. For the record, both the wax and oil coatings were applied a few days before the experiment. This time, the burning process started much more energetically. At first, I thought it was because the bandage was wrapped tighter or the gasoline was distributed differently on it, but that wasn't the case, as I realized later. Despite the initial flare-up, the wood eventually went out, and after about 15 minutes, the surface had cooled completely. The third board was treated with vegetable oil. It didn't stand out much, burning similarly to untreated wood, perhaps slightly better. In the end, it couldn't be set alight either. Here's how the boards looked after the tests. The wax-treated sample took the most damage, while the untreated wood was affected the least. I decided to run one more test, comparing the wax-coated board directly with the untreated one. The amount of bandage and gasoline was identical. Right away, it was clear that the wax-coated board burned better. This is likely due to the stearin vapors released during heating. Interestingly, it burned more vigorously this time than in the first test, possibly because the wax had been freshly applied right before the experiment. Another factor could have been the board's angle, which was less than 90 degrees, or even the way the bandage was wrapped. It's worth noting that in all cases, the gasoline-soaked bandage burned for 2 minutes or more, which is longer than the reconstructed arrow found in England. However, a mixture of sulfur and saltpeter could potentially produce higher burning temperatures. Overall, this experiment shouldn't be seen as the ultimate truth. Its purpose was to illustrate examples of small fire sources coming into contact with wood surfaces. In this experiment, the wax-treated board's surface caught fire, leading to the conclusion that information from some articles, and even my earlier video, about wax being a fireproofing method is incorrect. However, it's worth noting that while the wax-coated board burned quite intensely, it eventually self-extinguished. I didn't even need the prepared buckets of water. Another interesting observation is that only the surface layer, a few millimeters thick, was burned. So, what's the takeaway? Without a doubt, incendiary arrows did exist in the past, as evidenced by historical texts and the discovery of specialized arrowheads by archaeologists. However, crafting an arrow that wouldn't extinguish in flight, on impact, or lose its incendiary material was no simple task. Such arrows required complex, multi-component incendiary mixtures. Even then, a burning arrow hitting its target didn't guarantee it would ignite, even if the wood was dry and resinous. Setting hardwood or slightly damp wood alight through a small point of contact in just a few minutes of burning was extremely challenging. Incendiary arrows likely worked best when used in large numbers, increasing the odds of ignition. They were also more effective when buildings contained flammable materials like straw or reeds, which were often used for floors and roofs.